Okay, it's my honor to be the commentator of this great book that Dan Klein has written. And I should emphasize at the start, it's in many ways a great book. It's rich, it has many ideas, it's full of examples and so on. It's rich with anecdotes and examples, as Dan has illustrated already. And it's also the kind of book that stimulates your curiosity and even your way of criticizing things. And that's what characterizes a great book, Dan. So I will end with 3 or 4 questions in the end on areas where I don't agree with what you said and what you've written. Okay. But I'll start by saying that I sympathize to a large extent with the perspective, the Smithian, Hayekian, Michael Polanyian perspective on economics of society that Dan has just presented here. Many years ago, I did my own doctoral thesis actually about spontaneous orders, about invisible hand processes in markets, in civil society, and in politics. So I'm quite well read into this discourse about spontaneous orders, concatenate coordinations, and so on, that forms a large part of this book. Other parts I'm not that familiar with. I've also known Dan since, I think, 1996, where we met at the Montpellier conference in Vienna. And you got a prize for your essay called The Moral Triad of a Good Society: Liberty, Dignity, and Responsibility. And I take this book actually to be the summary of more or less your research over the last 20 years or so. So it's been a great read for me. As you already have understood, Dan Klein is a quite exceptional and rare economist. There is no math in this book. There is no econometrics in this book. It's explicitly liberal. He states at the very beginning that I take a very liberal outlook in this book. And as you all know, this is quite uncommon. But there is a great Swedish economist, Gunnar Myrdal, who already in 1930 also wrote a great book where he explicitly criticizes, well, economics as a field for not formulating their value statements. So he actually says you should do exactly what Dan Klein does. You should be explicit, and then you should open up for a positive analysis. But you should be clear about your values at the start, because he thinks that most economists do have values, as everyone else, but they're hidden. And I think this is an important point in your book. Implicitly, you criticize the rest of economics for not being explicit about their values. Now, having said all this, I think there's a basic tension in this book that I will focus on. It's a tension between, I think, a very liberal or market-oriented idea about learning, skepticism, and so on, knowledge, and a more dogmatic part of the book. And I think there is a tension here, and I will try to highlight that tension. What I like the most of the book is where you started yourself about knowledge. I think this book makes an original contribution to a field which one may call knowledge economics. There's been lots of writings in economics about information, asymmetric information, and so on. But as Dan very explicitly and very clearly explains in this book, it's all, as he says, knowledge flat talk. It flattens knowledge down to information. It disregards that people interpret having the same information. People interpret reality in different ways. They have different models of reality, if you want, and therefore they act in different ways. But to this interpretation, he also adds the aspects of judgment, the ability to choose the best model or interpretation of reality. And that's also where he focuses on, that's the role of the entrepreneur in the economy. The entrepreneur uses his judgment to as you say, find non-obvious opportunities. That's how they define it. He uses his unique interpretation, judgment to find non-obvious opportunities to create businesses and so on. And that's a very Israel Kurzweil way of looking at entrepreneurship. And it fits very well into this way of looking at knowledge, of the learning process and so on that you describe deeply in this second part of the book, actually. And this way of looking at knowledge as a core field of economics also puts an emphasis, of course, on economic freedom. Because if you have the choice of different interpretations, you have the same knowledge perhaps, the same information, but you interpret it in different ways. You have different knowledge. You have a choice. And if you're going to choose something, you have to have freedom, of course, to make these choices. So I think this is a strong case for a liberal outlook. If I should be a little bit critical here, I think you should connect these views that you have to all these new research about cognitive science, learning and so on, first order, second order learning. That's a huge literature out there that would make this arguments that you make stronger, in fact. You also, your second part of the book, that's the coordination part, is also something that I've been very much interested in myself. It's the Hayekian idea about spontaneous orders, about the invisible hand of the market, and so on. And you make this distinction between two kinds of coordinations. What Dan calls concatenate coordination, some kind of overall coordination within the setting of a market order, and what he calls mutual coordination, a Shelleyan type of coordination, riding on the same side of the road, or conventions in a general sense. To me, I'm not that convinced how fruitful this is and how much it adds to the existing literature. And I would like to, if I can find it, I would like to quote Friedrich von Hayek, who I think is the one who has developed this the most, the Smithian view about this kind of order that arises spontaneously in society. And the point that Hayek makes, and that's the point about the invisible hand that Smith makes, is that it's an unintended consequence. It's not the order that emerges through individual actions, which has no intention of creating the overall order. That's the whole point. So by order, Hayek says in his book Law, Legislation, Liberty, we shall throughout describe the state of affairs in which a multitude of elements of various kinds are so related to each other that we may learn from our acquaintance with some spatial or temporal part of the whole to form correct expectations concerning the rest, or at least expectations which have a good chance of proving correct. So Hayek actually focuses on expectations. He doesn't say much about coordination at all. I don't think that that's the main point he makes. There's some kind of overall order that emerges spontaneously from individual action unintentionally, and this order makes it possible for us to make better decisions. The pricing in the market and so on, languages, whatever kinds of spontaneous orders that are not planned, not directed from above. Now, you, Dan, in your way of analyzing this, you actually even think that these concatenate coordination can be planned within an enterprise and so on. You use that as an example a number of times. You don't at all emphasize what Hayek makes as one of his major points, the knowledge-creating part of a spontaneous order, even using tacit knowledge, not codified or explicit knowledge, because that knowledge is used within this kind of spontaneous process where individual actions are used. So I think you should have been a bit more Hayekian in this part of your book. And it should be connected to your knowledge part, because your knowledge economics, I think, is very fruitful, and if you had integrated that with your concatenate coordination, I think you would have benefited. The third point or major point I want to make is the Smithian Outlook that Dan started with, this quite normative perspective of how we as economists should perform our profession. And let me say from the beginning that I sympathize very much with this liberty maxim or liberty principle. And the maxim, as Dan just said, says by and large, between two policy reforms, the one that rates higher in liberty is more desirable. And as I just said before, there are strong arguments, empirical arguments, positive arguments for such a principle from this knowledge perspective. In order to use knowledge better in society, in order to open up for entrepreneurship and so on, we should make it possible for people to have the freedom to choose, to quote Milton Friedman. However, when you develop this further, you say that this Smithian outlook also means that we should disdain the distinction between the positive and the normative. Here I strongly disagree. I think it's very un-Smithian and very un-Scottish. David Hume, the first great Scottish philosopher, is famous for his Humean law, as some of you may have heard of. And it basically says that a moral conclusion cannot validly inferred from a non-moral premise. You cannot derive an ought from an is. And I think this was one of the major contributions of the Scottish philosophers. David Hume, Ferguson, Adam Smith, and so on. And now you try to move us backwards, and I don't like this. I think these positive arguments, I think we should be clear about our value judgments, but I do think that the positive arguments, which we can prove by empirical research and so on, positive arguments, also are very strong, and I think it's important to keep them separate. Also, I think your by and large thing that you add to this, remember first it was the principle, we should choose the policy that promotes liberty. Then Dan added that by and large we should do this. And he does this in order to criticize his more Austrian Miesian friends who believes they can deduce analytically the truth from basic principles and so on. So you open up for more empirical research and so on. It's not 100% principle, it's a, I don't know, 95% principle or something. And that makes me very curious, of course. What are these restrictions? When is the liberty principle or maxim not applicable? Is it cases, as Amartya Sen and other argues, that in certain situations, basic capabilities and so on are something that should override a liberty principle? Are there certain rights of others who may override our own liberty in certain ways? So I would find that very interesting to explore. And that's my first question that I will end with. Which are these by and large conditions? And I think perhaps you should devote your next 20 years to exploring these conditions. My second question is, how can we further develop this field of knowledge economics? I think you should make a paper about this. I think that field, it's not about, knowledge economy and human capital and all this. It's a different thing. It's how to extend the field of informational economics into something that's deeper. And Dan goes even into our heads, he's the deep self, and how do we interpret reality and how do we really learn? I think you should work more in that area as well, the next 20 years perhaps. Thirdly, and I haven't mentioned this, but one of the themes you have in your book, and you mentioned this, is the use of allegories and metaphors and so on, used to explain or help us understand how these very complex spontaneous orders what Hayek calls a catalaxy. How are we to understand this? And you introduce something that you call joy. I don't really like that either, to be honest, but that's open to discussion. This joy is someone is a she. She's modeled on what Adam Smith uses in The Moral Sentiment, his first major book from 1757, almost 20 years before The Wealth of Nations, where he uses something called impartial spectator, the man within himself, who impartially look at others when you make moral judgments, especially of your own moral judgments. And you generalize this into some being or metaphor for a being at least that can judge the overall order. That's how I interpret your way of writing about this. Well, I think we should think how we could find other metaphors or other ways of describing or explaining these overall spontaneous liberal orders. Lastly, should we not, as liberals, be especially sensitive to the Humean law of keeping the is and ought separate, because we know the consequences of not doing so? Thank you very much. Carl, the floor.
Yes, and now we will take questions, and you will be allowed to answer some questions. So if you join me up here. Okay. Do we have any questions?
Or do you want to comment?
You could comment first, and then we'll take questions. So Daniel, you be first. Then.
You want to comment on Nils first? Or?
I think it'd be nice to give folks a little chance to speak still. So maybe I'll try to. I got some notes on yours. I'm eager to.
Good.
So, okay. Thank you, Dan, for a great presentation. My name is Daniel Halvarsson. I'm a PhD student here at the Ratio Institute in economics. By the way, I'm a mathematician and econometrician, to just put it out there. But I more or less, or by and large, agree with you, Dan, on what you're saying. But nevertheless, I have a couple of questions, but I think I'll settle with one or two. First of all, you say that liberals should embrace, in the end, allegory. I was just curious if you would say the same for non-liberal economists, if they should also embrace allegory. And I think this will touch on what Nils was talking about. It's on cooperation. You gave us an example, a pub example, with two people who were supposed to meet up at the pub. But both were more happier if they would meet at the theater, as an example of mutual but not concatenate coordination. And then you briefly said that you use both to define cooperation. And I was curious if this example was one where cooperation wasn't present. I wasn't really sure how you defined cooperation. And maybe I can take one more. And the last one is actually about the by and large. I understand fully how it kind of relates to Mises and Rothbard and what Nils talked about, the praxeological type of epistemology. But what I was curious was how it would relate to more to the mainstream, which to me seems more or less loose, vague, and indeterminate in its policy conclusions. Take, for example, I don't know if this is the correct way of thinking about it, but the classical game theoretic modeling, where, at least as I see it, the interpretation and applications of these models are up for various judgments. To me, kind of loose, vague, and indeterminate in a way, even if the models themselves are robust and rigorous and consistent and all that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Don. So, Carl, help me. Where I answer questions at this time? All right, I still want to come back to Niels, but thanks, Don, very much. On the allegory, first of all, I'm saying liberals should embrace it and declare it. Maybe the more important word is declare it, because I think we're actually already doing allegory, whether we like to admit it or recognize it or not. Like I said, take Hayek's famous communication talk about the price system as communication. In a literal sense, I mean, a price is just, hey, this is yours for 6 crowns or whatever. That's really all communication is. It is a very powerful way of talking. Prices as communications, price signals. A signal is a communication sign, right? It's a very powerful way of talking, and we practice it, and I can show you tons of people talking this way. And I think if you look at it carefully, it really only makes sense by allegory. Sometimes this has been made explicit, for example, by Edwin Cannon. So this allegory thing is something I think that we're doing, it's really about declaring it, and actually by bringing it out and making it explicit, we make it more innocuous. We also see that we're depending on it, which also helps us prevent us from being criticized for contradicting ourselves and talking mumbo-jumbo about communication when we then deny allegory and things. So I see all sorts of benefits, actually, from declaring it. And yeah, I suppose non-liberals do. I definitely think non-liberals, I mean, we're talking allegories and metaphors all the time. You know, Sweden does this, Sweden thinks that, Sweden wants this. I mean, we all do that, and we're bound to. Organizations are metaphorical persons, and so on. So I don't really see this allegory thing as, it's not a proposal, really, to start talking about, to start using allegory. It's to just kind of acknowledge that it's there implicitly, perhaps only in what we're doing. I think there are benefits from bringing it more out into the open. I don't know if that... you asked about my definition of cooperation. I, in fact, didn't provide that in this. I just mentioned I used the 2 coordinations. Briefly, cooperation, as I see it, is a group of people having a shared sense of the concatenation they are trying to advance. So concatenate coordination is part of it. But then they have a mutual coordination sense of actually shared experience and mutual coordinated actions to advance the concatenate coordination. Teamwork, cooperation. So I see the 2 different coordinations playing a vital role in in cooperation. And again, when if we want to talk about the free enterprise system as a system of cooperation, we have to admit that the folks who put these wires in here in Indonesia or whatever, I've got no mutual sense of coordination with them, no mutual sense of advancing I don't know who they are, and they don't know me, and they have a million other things, and it's disjointed knowledge. The whole mutual framework is sort of more of a common knowledge type framework. It's kind of a in-person setting thing. And so, again, I think that we want to embrace this idea of cooperation. We want to talk about free enterprise and the economy as a system of cooperation, but to do so, again, we have to rely on allegory. And we're calling upon an allegory in which, not like reality, but in an allegory, a fairy tale, in which we are a team under the quarterback of joy, cooperating. Now, I know that sounds like a crazy idea, but I still insist that I really think that that's implicitly what we do. And that I favor talking about cooperation in such terms. Neil doesn't like joy, and all that. I've responded a little bit to your things on that. And yes, joy is definitely a kind of modeled after the impartial spectator. The impartial spectator in Smith is actually a universal being. There's only one impartial spectator in Smith in Theory of Moral Sentiments. It's not, the impartial spectator is not your conscience. It's actually not your man in the breast. It's, if you took the man in the breast is my conscience, and if you took the conscience of the man in my breast and you kept sort of iterating that would converge, as it were, to the impartial spectator. And the important thing to understand is that, you know, your conscience conscience is the same as my conscience conscience conscience. And in that sense, joy is this universal, it's you know, a premise of a universal ethical point of view, but which sees all the different situations, trees and branches of different decisions, and hence allows for variation or relativism. So it kind of, I think it also disdains the relativist, absolutist distinction in ethics. Anyhow, so Daniel also asked about by and large and loose, vague, and indeterminate. I'm not quite sure I got the gist of your question. In fact, let me jump to Niels's version of that instead. And then we'll take the next question. I think that's a great question, Niels. So where are the exceptions? What are some of the exceptions? And I'm not about like, oh, these are the exceptions I recognize, and you know, I actually think that this law is good, and that contravention of liberty isn't good. Is that? I'm generally quite a free market guy, and also sort of libertarian on, you know, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And you know, in terms of public policy, I'm not personally such a partaker or anything, and I don't advise it personally. It's just that as far as policy goes, and I'm also not. I'm basically, you know, not sympathetic with the welfare state. But of course, there are exceptions. I mean, would I actually want to legalize all sorts of guns and explosives? I mean, the liberty principle presumably would let people, you know, go out and buy a bazooka and sort of put it over their fireplace and cherish it or whatever they might do with it. Well, I don't. How would I define the exceptions? Find the exceptions. They come up in discussion, obviously, which is what we're all sort of trying to participate in. No, it's more practice. It's more, we start from the status quo, I would say, and read the newspaper and so on. But I mean, there are exceptions, and also here on this whole question of what are the exceptions. I mean, if I were the governor of Virginia, I might have to exercise eminent domain, and I'd push that button if I had to use eminent domain to get a good highway built. I might, you know. So it's not so much like I've got a list of these interventions that I favor, but it's more like I don't want to deny them. I mean, should the U.S. have not pitched in against Hitler? I mean, the U.S. had to draft people and tax people and bomb innocent people, all initiations of coercion. Are you really going to oppose the U.S. participation in that? While, you know, Hitler's doing what he's doing. So I mean, I just think, of course, you know, there's no final absolute. Liberty is the formulaic answer to all questions. That's a preposterous outlook, and so you allow of exceptions. You know, whether it's 95% or 90%, or I'm just saying it's enough to have the presumption, like in the courtroom, there's a presumption of innocence. And so where does the discussion begin? What should be the terms of the debate? You know, liberalism in the liberal era, the true liberal era, was ascendant and had that sort of presumption up until the end of the 19th century. And we lost that. And now the presumption is essentially the status quo. And other than that, I don't really see any specific presumption. I want to have, you know, I think liberalism is about promoting, again, a presumption of liberty, and by and large is good enough, is good enough to have that. So maybe we should turn to the next question. Is someone going to take the microphone? The point of this is to be able to hear it on the video. Maybe we'll wind back to that.
Thank you very much, Professor Klein, for an excellent presentation. My name is Patrick Cresson. I have a question, which is you're an economist, but still I would like to hear about what role do you see legislation playing vis-a-vis this liberty maxim or liberty principle? Do you see legislation as something that is always sort of connected with planning, or do you see it as maybe facilitating maybe not spontaneous orders, but facilitating cooperation in the sense that you're talking about in any way?
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick. This kind of relates to the whole, by and large, liberty maxim issue. I mean, look, you know, I very much think, whether we like it or not, we're stuck in a status quo, and I'm not that interested, unlike the Rothbardians, for example, in like kind of coming up with some ideal political system and what should be the role of legislation in that ideal political system. I'm really interested in just engaging in politics and stuff. If we had a proportional system in the States like you did, I'd probably go out and even vote. In our system, it's kind of, so, of course, I mean, there is legislation. If you think about how I phrase the liberty principle, I actually anchor it in the status quo, because it's about ranking two or favoring either of two reforms. A reform is a change to the status quo. The status quo is the experience we know. I'm a very Humean in this sense, and Smithian, because I think both of these guys have this strong sense of, it's not about some abstract ideal, it's about where we are and making it better. It's about improvement, not progress towards some ideal goal. These reforms, we can talk about radical reforms, but I like to, if we do, I like to talk about them one at a time. I don't like to abolish more than one government agency in one conversation. I think that our conversations about abolishing government agencies should be separate conversations. I don't want to sort of nuke every government agency at the same time. That's my attitude. So of course there's legislation, and of course I want the liberal politicos to do good and do right and use legislation and so on. I mean, it's just the world we live in. I don't mind more abstract, or if you like, utopian talk about whole better worlds and reconstructing them. They can certainly be useful. It's not where I see myself sort of discoursing. Another question?
I'm Erik Löckerman from Stockholm School of Economics. My question is about, you mentioned Brian Kaplan's idea on rational or irrational voters. And since I've done some research on that question that seems to contradict some of the aspects, at least, I'm just asking, to what extent does it matter for your analysis whether Brian Kaplan is right or wrong?
I think Brian and I mean, first of all, the part of my book that kind of covers the same kind of questions he engages with his whole book is really part of a chapter. So it's something along the way. But I think that we are congruent, and so I'm not really disagreeing with Brian. I'm more putting some of, I think, Brian's critique of sort of a sort of democratic, what he calls democratic fundamentalism, in fact, in his book. His critique of that, sort of in my idiom, if you like. And I think we are actually sort of saying very similar things, but I'm using what he calls rational irrationality, I call bad interpretation. So to some extent, I think we're just, using different words to get at the same kind of points about, how democracy can go wrong. Does that make sense?
my question was more or less that does it matter for your analysis whether voters are rational or irrational? Does it change your interpretation? Because this is an empirical question.
If you mean, does it matter for me whether sort of common political instincts tend to, as it were, get it right or get it wrong? That matters a lot, I would say, to the motivation of much of this book, and indeed, I think I would say to perhaps to the whole reasons for embracing this S outlook that I talk about. If certain ideas about liberty were so instinctive to people and intuitive to people that they actually went out and commonly kind of came up with those ideas themselves and those positions themselves and favored those policies, then I think this whole outlook would maybe not need this book. So I think it kind of pertains to motivating why this matters. I don't know, I'm not sure if that helps.
Pavel Pelikan, now from Prague University of Economics. I have one little objection and then one question. I have two, but one was already asked. So the objection is the first, you seem to facilitate your argument by reducing economics, that they all flatten knowledge into information. And I would like to point out that there is a growing, an old field of economics, I would say, started by Herbert Simon and the cognitive processes and now the behavioral economics, and they make a very good distinction between competencies or knowledge or talents and information that is used, and it's also one of my specialties, and I like to distinguish that people are differently rational, that this is a problem for, or differently competent, this is a problem then also for markets to sort this out. So I think that this is like you created a straw man, which is easy to beat. And this is my objection. And the two questions were like the first was basically as if you make when you speak of interventionism, the difference actually from Hayek between specific measures and general rules. That if you, for instance, now I see the ratio has these laws, rules in their program, so you must admit that maybe some laws must be made, but you already said so. Maybe the more specific question would be if government has now some useful, or legislator some useful area to do about the regulation of different regulation of financial markets and banks and so on. But then I have one broad question. I sort of like your joy, but in the condition that I interpret it as evolution. That there is some sort of selection of forms of societies that eventually will tell us what's wrong and what's not, that it may not be what we wish, that there is a difference between the institutional rules and frameworks which we may love and the ones which will prove sustainable given the type of people, of Homo sapiens that we have to deal with, which are very unequal in rationality, have a certain limited tolerance to inequalities, etc. So if we could find some translation from joy to evolution, maybe I would be on your side.
Okay, I'll put that here. Oh, thank you, Pavel. Your point about Herbert Simon and others who are trying to go beyond flat talk is well taken. I am not so familiar with all that literature. I know that you are, and I know that it's out there. And you say they talk about competencies and talents. I think that a lot of that literature is doing that, and Kahneman, of course, is doing that, and that pertains to some of your points about integrating with, connecting up with those. And I think all that would be a good thing to do. And every time I tune in to Kahneman or to so on, I see the fit. I mean, I don't think it's a hard thing to do to align. But still, I don't, you say I create a straw man, and maybe I do a little, but really, I mean, some of you guys, I'm sure, taking econ courses, and you know that knowledge is flattened down to information. I mean, it's asymmetric information. That's like the extent of the richness. That's what's really in most of the models. The folks you're talking about are not so much model builders. They need the common knowledge assumption to bring closure to the models. Do you disagree with that?
Many need it, but not all. For instance, I would claim I don't need it. I think we need to make point of information and point of rationality.
Okay, but
The model.
in a mathematical model.
Yes.
Okay, well, okay, my interpretation, maybe my game theory is, not up to date, but it seems to me that in fact, I quote several game theory textbooks saying that they assume the common knowledge assumption. And common knowledge assumption is essentially interpretational symmetry assumption. So it is very pervasive, certainly, in what Deirdre McCloskey calls max U economics, maximizing utility economics. Okay, you asked about interventionism, specific laws versus general laws. Help me again. What
Specific measures like government should invest or just regulate investment
Okay.
banks.
Look, I know that I use this liberty thing. I want to make it central and explicit, but I know that there are, in fact, ambiguities about liberty. I kind of say, oh, rank them in terms of liberty, and then the better ones more. Well, how do you rank them in terms of liberty? I know something about the problems with that, and in fact, I've written about that, but not in this book. I'm sure there's a lot more to know and to think, and I know that there's problems. But again, just because you don't have a grammar doesn't mean you don't make headway when it's important. And things with finance, especially things where there's government insurance, say deposit insurance or bailouts, in one sense, a measure can be increasing liberty in the sense of maybe allowing bankers to invest or take risks. But there's another sense in which it's a liberty which will come around to bite the taxpayer, which is coercive. And so in an overall sense, it might be less liberty. And that is a distinction between what I call direct and overall liberty. And so I understand those problems, and I just think we need to, and that relates a little bit to the whole maxim and the by and large and the exceptions. Your point about evolution, I think I understand the drift. I just want to say that David Hume and Adam Smith, but maybe especially Hume, are incredibly evolutionary. And I think in particular of Hume's Natural History of Religion, where he talks about the evolution towards monotheism. After all, the impartial spectator is sort of like a surrogate, an ethical surrogate for monotheism. And in that sense, it's been interpreted as sort of Smith's sort of secular Enlightenment substitute for religion. And so, yes, indeed, I see the connection between this joy bit and sort of what works in society and how it evolves, and it being really very tacit in people's more day-to-day moral judgments. And of course, the ones that prosper are stronger, are more likely to survive, and so on. So I see the connection there, at least. What's up, Carl?
I can take one more question, and then we close the program, so.
Yeah, okay. I also want to try to get back to positive and normative, perhaps. Should I just do that?
Yeah, please do.
Okay, sure. And anything else that Nils may have said, which were wonderful comments. Let me just jump to positive and normative. Again, I'm not really, I'm not sort of saying, I sort of don't like the distinction. It's not that I'm saying it's one or the other or something like that. Because it's very interesting you bring up the Hume is ought thing. One interpretation of Hume on that is that what he's really saying or getting at, and I frankly tend to think this interpretation could be just my reading of Hume, is that what he's sort of saying is that, of course, oughts are in there from the beginning. And that's why writers so naturally fall more explicitly into oughts when they get further along in their discourse, because they've been doing oughts all along, and it's oughts indeed that it motivated the whole enterprise of writing something and of reading it on the part of the reader. So I see ises and oughts as easily translatable into each other. I see discourse of any sort as a moral enterprise with purpose. We do these things because we're trying to contribute to something. We're trying to cooperate, trying to advance some kind of concatenation. We may not have a very similar idea of what that concatenation is and what makes it better coordinated. But and so I just see everything as normative, if you want to put it that way. Does that mean they're not positive? No, I wouldn't. I mean, does that mean that they're? Again, I think you can translate ises and oughts into each other very, very naturally. Give me an ought and I'll translate into an is for you. That relates to your point about Myrdal and his pitch for ideological openness. It started with the early book that you mentioned, and that particular point became more explicit in another book later published. And I think that's right. I mean, I think it's part of being human to have bents, to have purposes, to have priors, to have agendas. And in fact, I think our discourse is that we're less corrupt or less biased the more open we are about who we are. Just like you'd want to know if a guy's testifying on financial deregulation, if he's got vested interests in certain banks, right? You'd want that disclosure. Similarly, people, when they have ideological point of views, I mean, research shows that we don't usually change our ideology after the age of 25. That's a very strong commitment that matters to us as we go forward. And so I would like to know what the guy thinks politically when he testifies, because that's almost just like a vested interest as well. Yeah, I guess one way to think of it is that is again just sort of like I see everything as normative, and of course, why else would we be doing it? Maybe that's it then. All right. Thank you for your attention.